Baik, selamat pagi, Bapak-bapak, Ibu-ibu, teman-teman semua. So, Winnie, allow me to just to say hello to people in bahasa Indonesia. Ya, selamat pagi, Bapak-bapak, Ibu-ibu, teman-teman semua. Terima kasih telah meluangkan waktu untuk ikutan hadir menyimak acara atau diskusi AreaScape yang diselenggarakan oleh Pusat Riset Kewilayahan di BRIN pada pagi ini. Dan AreaScape ini adalah AreaScape yang ke-11. Jadi sebelum kita mulai dengan diskusi pagi ini, barangkali saya akan sedikit memperkenalkan apa itu AreaScape. Oh ya, sebelumnya bagi teman-teman yang belum kenal, nama saya Fajar Ibnu Tufail. Saya Kepala Pusat Riset Kewilayahan atau PRW BRIN yang pagi ini menyelenggarakan acara ini. Nah, PRW BRIN ini sejak kira-kira 2 tahun yang lalu ya, itu sudah memiliki seri diskusi atau webinar yang disebut sebagai AreaScape. AreaScape ini agak sedikit berbeda dengan formatnya agak sedikit berbeda dengan webinar-webinar yang lain, karena dalam AreaScape ini kita diharapkan atau kami berharap acara ini bisa menjadi sarana untuk berdiskusi atau bertukar pikiran tentang masalah-masalah yang bersifat cenderung lebih konseptual dan lebih theoretical tentang tidak hanya area studies atau kajian wilayah, tetapi juga ilmu-ilmu sosial dan humaniora pada umumnya. Nah, tetapi bukan berarti semua kegiatan di AreaScape ini bersifat theoretical dan konseptual, tetapi ada juga beberapa yang juga merupakan bahasan yang cukup berimbang antara konseptual dan empirical ya. Tetapi memang sengaja di setup atau desain dari AreaScape ini adalah berada dalam diskusi yang sifatnya konseptual dan teoretikal. Nah, kami di PRW memiliki beberapa seri lain yang lebih difokuskan kepada diskusi-diskusi yang bersifat kasus atau studi kasus, empirical finding, dan juga kajian-kajian yang sifatnya khusus tentang satu atau dua wilayah tertentu. Nah, karena sifatnya yang seperti itu, maka dalam AreaScape ini biasanya ada dua format yang kami gunakan, yaitu format yang mirip seperti talk show. Artinya kita berdiskusi dengan narasumber atau resource person ya kita sebutnya, dan kemudian dari diskusi itu difokuskan terutama kepada eh, perjalanan karya-karya dari narasumber atau resource person, dan juga beberapa persoalan konseptual yang ditekuni oleh para resource person. Kemudian yang format kedua itu biasanya kita juga bisa melakukan presentasi dan kemudian nanti akan diikuti oleh diskusi singkat antara saya dengan resource person, dan kemudian nanti dilanjutkan dengan diskusi terbuka dengan audiens. Oleh karena itu, kalau teman-teman perhatikan di poster itu kita menggunakan istilah navigator ya instead of moderator, karena yang kita harapkan itu adalah nanti kita bisa berdiskusi dalam konteks yang seperti apa namanya ya terbuka tetapi juga terarah gitu dalam beberapa persoalan-persoalan yang ingin kita angkat. Nah, untuk rekaman-rekaman AreaScape sebelumnya dari nomor 1 sampai nomor 10 itu tersedia di YouTube Pusat Riset Kewilayahan. Nanti minta tolong Mas Fikri bisa di-share di chat room ya. Link ke YouTube channel kita. Jadi nanti bisa dilihat di situ cukup beragam tema-temanya, dan menurut saya tema-tema yang cukup menarik dalam kajian area studies. Baik, terima kasih. Itu pengantar saya dan sedikit informasi tentang apa itu AreaScape. Nah, untuk pagi ini kita kedatangan tamu yang sangat menarik, Profesor Whitney Bauman. Beliau adalah pengajar atau dosen di Florida International University di Amerika, dan beliau ada di Indonesia sekarang ini sebagai Fulbright Scholars yang sedang melakukan penelitian di Yogyakarta kerjasama dengan Universitas Gadjah Mada. Nah, Profesor Bauman atau Whitney saya biasa panggil adalah seorang religious religious studies scholar, dan juga merangkap sebagai antropolog, dan beliau ini banyak menekuni kajian-kajian yang dalam topik kajian religion and environment. Sebentar ya, sebentar Bapak Ibu. Ya, maaf ada interupsi sedikit. Jadi Whitney ini banyak menulis tentang hubungan antara religion, spirituality, dan juga lingkungan. Dan kali ini pagi ini beliau akan membawakan materi yang berjudul Thinking Through the Anthropocene, Paradigms in Environmental Humanities. Jadi ini merupakan sebuah tema yang saat ini memang sedang sangat menarik dan banyak ditekuni di beberapa tempat, yaitu melihat persoalan-persoalan Anthropocene. Jadi bagaimana nanti ini akan menerangkan sedikit apa yang disebut sebagai Anthropocene, tetapi juga ada beberapa isu yang sebenarnya menjadi turunan dari diskusi yang banyak dikerjakan atau banyak dilakukan terkait dengan Anthropocene. Nah, salah satunya adalah dekolonisasi pengetahuan. Nah, Whitney banyak sekali menulis tentang atau sangat sangat concern tentang persoalan dekolonisasi pengetahuan ini, dan beliau ingin mencoba memaparkan pagi ini membahas atau mendiskusikan tentang bagaimana pendekatan paradigmatik yang baru dalam environmental humanities itu bisa kita pakai sebagai salah satu cara untuk mendekolonisasi pengetahuan kita khususnya tentang lingkungan. Nah, itu akan menjadi salah satu pendekatan baru yang kemudian seringkali disebut sebagai relational ontology, dan ini satu pendekatan yang dipengaruhi oleh gerakan new materialism dan juga gerakan yang khususnya bermula dari pemikiran-pemikiran Bruno Latour tentang relasi manusia dengan non manusia atau more than human relation. Nah, nanti kita akan berdiskusi lebih jauh dengan Whitney tentang soal ini. Tapi untuk saat ini saya akan I will give time to Whitney to present his PowerPoint materials. So, okay, Whitney, it's your turn, and you can share your material directly from here. Okay.
Okay. Well, terima kasih Pak Fajar for this invitation, and Pak Suhadi for organizing, and selamat pagi to everyone here. I apologize if my internet sort of goes out, then I'll be back. It always comes back on, so just be patient, and I will return. It's great to be here with you all today, and I just want to think a little bit with you about how to think about knowledge in an era that is sort of post-human, in an era where climate change and globalization sort of set the tone for how we might want to think about knowledge and knowledge production. And so I'm titling this Thinking Through the Anthropocene, Paradigms in Environmental Humanities, because I think the environmental humanities, that is resituating humans within the rest of the natural world and thinking about topics that way, is one method for how we might think beyond the human-centric way of organizing knowledge and disciplines, university disciplines. Okay, so I'm just going to start here with a quote by Sylvia Wynter, who is a decolonial scholar. She is from Jamaica, and she writes here, referring to Toni Morrison, who is an African-American novelist and scholar in the United States. She writes, Toni Morrison uncovers the terms of being educationally and socially habituated and domesticated in a world where the bluest eye is not only iconic of the Western bourgeoisie liberal human, phenotypically racially white, aesthetic corporeal standard. In addition, she also gives origin to what can now be seen in hindsight as the positive signifiers, the institutionalized and ostensibly universally applicable norm of being human and thereby of white beauty that semantically activate the neurochemical opiate reward process. Now, what she's talking about here is that the current disciplines of the modern Western university that separates the humanities and the sciences into different realms, and then also has a particular understanding of what it means to be a cultured human, is based upon the era of colonization, right? And this ideal human becomes sort of white, European, male, at one time Christian. This becomes the norm for what human is. And this is written into the very structure of the disciplines that become the modern Western university. Excuse me. And so what she's trying to say then is that if this is the case, then we really need to rethink the disciplines. And you know, it's interesting. Any walk through a grocery store here in Indonesia, I always walk past an aisle of skin whiteners and skin whitening creams, and I wonder to myself, this is what Sylvia Wynter is talking about. This ideal of the white aesthetic beauty that gets written into the idea of what it means to be human in the humanities. Tomaka Masuzawa, a religious studies scholar, a post-colonial religious studies scholar, wrote a book called, that maybe you're familiar with, called The Invention of World Religions. And in that book, she says this, you know, both religion and science are developed, what we think of as religion, what we think of as science, are developed during the colonial era, and through a colonial process of the European colonizer asking, what in your culture looks like our religion, right? So they were looking for texts, they were looking for theology, understandings of God, right? And so they create these separate categories of what is Hinduism, right? What is Buddhism, and this sort of thing, right? And they basically don't even acknowledge for a long time the indigenous traditions, right? They're thought of as primitive because there's no writing, most of it's oral, this sort of thing, right? So she's talking about how our very concept of religion in the modern Western university is a colonial one, right? And a European one. And of course, all the people at that time that were in the 19th century that were trying to do the history of religions would start with the primitive traditions and then move up into Eastern traditions and then the monotheisms. But then, of course, Christianity became the most developed religion, right? Because they were all Christians looking back into this record. And so this is the type of colonial history Masuzawa is trying to point out when she's talking about the colonial construct of religion. Walter Mignolo, another post-colonial scholar, wrote a couple of books, The Darker Side of Western Modernity and The Dark Side of the Renaissance. The Dark Side of the Renaissance is, which most of you may be familiar with, is the book that says, look, the Renaissance creates the Dark Ages, which is the Golden Age of Islam, which is they just say, oh, this was the Dark Ages, right? So that knowledge can move from the Greco-Roman world right into the Middle Ages of the European world and skip over all of the contributions that the Muslim world makes to natural philosophy and what becomes modern science. And the darker side of Western modernity, he says, look, whatever we call modernity and development and progress depends upon the colonization and subjugation process of others, and also the extraction of resources from others. So this is the darker side of what modernity is. Modernity and development depend on underdevelopment and colonization. And science, both science and religion have been a part of, particularly Christianity has been a part of that process as Europeans initially had direct colonization, but now as there is sort of the neoliberal economic colonization that goes on predominantly coming out of Western cultures and traditions and thought. So Sylvia and Mignolo and Masuzawa are all asking, how, if this human of humanity is this type of ideal person that doesn't match onto most of the bodies in the world, then we need to break open that concept and we need to rethink the university from a multiplicity of humanities rather than just this this ideal one. And they're really critiquing this single tunnel of history that the modern West tried to create, that goes from the Greco-Roman world to the Christian Europe to the European, and then on into sort of the US, right? Exceptionalism, this sort of thing, right? Skipping over the contribution of Muslims and Ottoman Empire and so forth, and also making Eastern traditions as the past, right? So from the European 0 point during the colonial period, the East, India, China, Japan, all become the past. Europe is the present. The future is the West, right? The westward expansion. That is the sort of timeline it takes on. And this also takes on many metaphors, from Christianizing to enlightening to cultivating to educating to developing, these sorts of things, right? These are all sort of within that same sort of timeline, within that same sort of understanding. And this is what Winter and others are trying to point out and critique. Another important critique of these colonial style knowledge discourses comes from, I think, not just Native American indigenous discourses, but also indigenous peoples from all over the world. Margaret Kovach, who's pictured here, writes in her book Indigenous Methodologies that the modern Western models of knowledge production assume the universe is empty, static, and do not shift or change. God, through Newtonian physics, does not have a role in the cause and effect of the universe, and prophecy or a greater purpose does not exist, as life is simply a cause and effect dynamic, and all energy patterns can be accounted for by human intellect, with humans as all-knowing. Right? So this is the basic modern paradigm of what nature is, right? And humans are above it. And only humans have reason. And if we use our reason to get behind the material world, we will eventually reach an Archimedean point of objective universal knowledge, right? This flies in the face of most ways of producing knowledge. That is, that humans are a part of nature. Nature is alive, right? Nature is even animistic or inspirited, or at least has value and purpose and meaning, and humans are a part of it, right? So knowledge production from the monotheistic sort of universalistic perspective places knowledge above material world, so that everybody has to come to that same point to realize what true knowledge is. If you flatten that ontology, then knowledge production becomes about listening to other perspectives and putting together those perspectives, weaving those perspectives in and out to say, hey, what does this mean to your culture, your community, your perspective? And so Kovach talks about this as a process of yarning together stories, or storytelling, and tying together multiple stories to get a better understanding of what we're dealing with, of what the natural world is, of what life is about, right? So storytelling and yarning together is a huge part of what she sees as an indigenous methodology for knowledge production. She also, like feminists and liberation types thinking and critical theories, faces a huge emphasis on embodied knowing, right? On situated knowledge, that none of us is in this objective space. We're all embodied, and we have language, culture, we have affects and emotions. We have long institutional ways of thinking about the world that shape the way that we think about the world, right? So we need to focus on embodied knowing. And part of that is looking at the embodied knowing of that Western objective mindset and seeing it as an embodied way of knowing that disvalues emotion, that places a bridge between humans and the rest of nature, that has an idealized version of what humans are, that has this hierarchy of knowledge. That is also a learned way of knowing, right? So making modern Western objective thought also a parochialism. It is embodied, right? They also have a focus then on the pluriverse, right? On multiple perspectives, right? There's not just one perspective, but any given event, place, happening, whether it's historical or current, has multiple perspectives. And the more perspectives we gain on that given event, place, or thing, the better understanding we will have of that given thing. So knowledge then is, in her words, and many indigenous scholars, when they're explaining their methodologies, right, similar things. Knowledge is intersubjective. It involves multiple people, right? Even scientists in laboratories are working together and attaching their knowledge to what's come before and hopefully what will come next, right? So it's an intersubjective process. Knowledge is not constructed alone. It's value laden. It's always knowledge for. What are we trying to do with this knowledge? Is a question that we should always ask. Humans are embedded in a larger planetary community, and there's a huge focus on places, right? What does this knowledge do to a given place or places, right? Knowledge is just not sort of out there, but it affects things. Knowledge gets mobilized and changes things in the world. So this is the sort of some of the areas that I'm trying to work with to rethink what the humanities might be today in a sort of post-human or at least climate changing globalized world. So what I argue is that we need to sort of reattune our thinking, our disciplines towards these contemporary planetary contexts. So what we call for then is undisciplined thinking, right? If the disciplines of the university, of the modern Western university that have been globalized in most places are what have led to, in part, climate change, economic injustice, extinction of species, so on and so forth, then we need to undiscipline our thinking and reattune the ways that we think to the contemporary planetary community. Jack Halberstam, a theorist in the United States, talks about the queer art of failure. And what he means by that is that if our institutions are failing so many people, then we need to fail our institutions so that we can deconstruct and reconstruct them in more positive ways. So what we then need maybe are something like the post-humanities or the planetary humanities, right? Something like this. And before I say a little bit more about what that might look like, I just want to sort of talk about all the different types of reattunements. Sorry, I'm trying to fool with my video or cameras here. I want to talk about all the different types of reattunements that I'm talking about. It's not just sort of knowledge and epistemological, but we're talking about aesthetic reattunements, right? What types of worlds do we want to live in? Do we want to work towards the Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos world, which is literally out of this world? Let's create a colony on Mars. Let's create a space station and forget about the Earth. It's too late. Is that what we want to do? Because that requires our knowledge to be directed in a certain way. Or do we want to focus on justice and planetary flourishing with the planet we have, right? So this aesthetic reattunement, how do we rethink ourselves back into the planetary community if indeed we think we want to stay here and that the planet matters and that other animals matter, this sort of thing. We need also ethical reattunements, right? Thinking about earth justice and planetary justice and not just sort of retributive justice, right? So how do we think about ethics in this embedded planetary way? Not ethics just for humans, but ethics for humans and the rest of the natural world. What about musical reattunement, right? So music can help us to reattune our aesthetic sensibilities to certain moments, right? This is what chanting, singing is all about, and religious rituals, right? To connect people in the moment. What type of music might help us, right? If we think about the origin of music, it comes from the earliest instruments are bone flutes, right? And the bone flutes, the notes of the bone flute, to the best of archaeologists and anthropologists' knowledge, were mimicking birdsong, right? So we could say that we learned to sing and we learned to do all this from the birds, right? So how can we help reconnect things like music to the planetary community? Bodily reattunements, right? There's all sorts of sources and religious rituals, right, that help us attune our bodies to get us out of our heads and back into our bodies and our connections, right? Yoga, meditation, dancing, perhaps pilgrimage, right? These sorts of things help us reattach to specific places and other bodies, right? So how can we think with these bodies instead of thinking outside of these bodies, right? Again, epistemological reattunements that I've already talked about, and of course textual reattunements, right? There's a whole body of scholarship now on eco-hermeneutics, right, that are going back and looking at the Quran and the Bible and the Torah and sutras to look at how we might think more about how other animals and the rest of the natural world fare in these texts. And it's not just a human drama, but it's a drama about the rest of the natural world as well. So these are the types of things that I'm talking about in terms of reattuning our thinking and our knowing and our being towards beyond the Anthropocene, towards a planetary understanding. And this, I always want to remind folks when I am doing these talks that this is not just a a single reattunement, but because we are differently embodied, we're going to attune to the world in different ways. So there can be multiple reattunements in the world, right? There doesn't have to be just one. And Walter Mignolo points this out in his work with the Zapatistas in his book on the darker side of Western modernity. This is what he calls the Zapatista revolution, right? The Zapatistas' theoretical revolution. The Zapatistas taught many of us that if somebody could just mute, I'm sorry, there's somebody that's unmuted and I keep getting some background noise and it just distracts me a little bit. Just make sure that you're on mute if you don't mind. The Zapatistas taught many of us that to change the world as it is may be an impossible task, but to build, if you could just make sure that you're on mute, that would be super helpful. Thank you. Okay. The Zapatistas taught many of us that to change the world as it is may be an impossible task, but to build a world in which many worlds would coexist is a possible task. Their authorizations are dangerous for the sheer reason that building a world in which many worlds will coexist demands epistemic disobedience and epistemic delinking, right? That's that undiscipline of thinking. That is precisely the irrevocable contribution of the Zapatistas' theoretical revolution. So what it means is that we don't have to think of ourselves as building a single world across all different cultures and histories together, but we can have multiple worlds and link them together. They don't have to completely overlap, but we can link them together, and all those multiple worlds linked together at any one moment become the planetary, right? So the planetary is emergent. It's not a container that everybody has to fit into, but the planetary emerges in a sort of moment by moment basis, right? It's a process, just like knowledge production is a process, right? So what do I mean by this sort of planetary, right? Again, I want to read this quote by Anna Tsing, and she writes, "Other species as well as non-living things make it possible to be human," right? We are not human without the rest of the planet. That this statement is not obvious to many humans at this moment in time is only because of the habits of thought that have become powerful over the last few hundred years. In this modernist mode of thinking, humans presume to transcend and master nature, rather than forming worlds together with non-humans. One significance of recent discussion of the Anthropocene as a time of human-sponsored environmental crisis is that it urges us away from those powerful habits of thought. It urges us away from human exceptionalism. The imagined mastery of humans no longer looks so successful, right? We really can't master nature, and climate change is just one proof of that. We are asked to reconsider the ways in which human and non-human histories are inextricably intertwined. The Anthropocene, like every other trajectory in which humans have been involved, is more than human. So she's just reiterating, right, that whatever it means to be human, it comes from the planet and not in spite of it. Our best qualities emerge out of our relationships with other animals and the rest of the natural world. We wouldn't live without the microbiome in our guts, right? that allow us to digest. In fact, your body contains more non-human cells than human cells, right? Because of all the critters and bacteria and things that live in our bodies that allow us to exist and live, right? So we really are ecosystems unto ourselves, as well as being part of other ecosystems. So I don't want to spend too much on sort of the current context because we all know it, right? So, but this context of globalization and the space-time crunch, right? That we're all much closer together in a certain sense through the increase in speed of communication, transportation, and production on a daily basis. Even if we don't travel, our lives are crisscrossed by the flows of energy, information, and materials from all around the world, right? So we live in this sort of space-time crunch, right? We also live in an era where we've seen pictures of the Earth from outer space. So we know that all of history, all of religions, all of evolution, all of life lives on this one single planet, right? So perhaps then we might think of multiple truths rather than a single truth that encompasses the planet, right? I think globalization also highlights our hybridity, that there are no pure traditions. Judaism draws from religions in the ancient Near East, ancient Mesopotamian, Babylonian traditions, Zoroastrianism. Christianity draws off of those and its relationship with Judaism, right, as it emerges. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism help form one another over the course of history. The same with Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism. And now, because of globalization, we all have access to so many different traditions, right? So there may be people that identify as Christian that meditate and do yoga, or maybe people draw from many different traditions and many different types of prayer in their daily lives, right? Or the sort of thinking about within Islam, right? You have sort of Javanese versions of Islam, and you have Saudi versions of Islam, and then you have versions of Islam that exist in Chicago in the United States, right? So what I'm saying is that all of these traditions are hybrid historically and contemporaneously, right? So there's no pure tradition. And so what we need then is a hermeneutics of globalization and pluralism rather than orthodoxy, I would argue, in this time of globalization. And then, of course, globalization is also an economic thing, the spread of neoliberal style economics over the face of the planet, right? And it's also fossil fueled, right? The speed at which we live is so much faster than the speed at which our parents or grandparents lived. And the things that we can do in one lifetime are just vastly more than could do 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And of course, this differs depending on where you're born into the planet. And part of this speed has led to this fossil fueled lifestyle has led to climate change, right? So climate change, right, is another thing that really changes, I think, the way we have to think about knowledge, humans, ethics, and the future of what it means to be human in the world. Climate change means this idea of an end of some pure nature that's out there, if people had that idea at all, right? There is no pure nature that we come to, right? But humans are part of nature. And that's why they call the Anthropocene the geological layer that is identified now in the Earth's crust record, right? As the human era, right? The fossil fueled era, I think, would be a better name for it. So I think climate change helps us to see that we exist within this matrix of human nature technology, right? Everything is part of the planet and therefore part of nature. Otherwise, it's alien. So do we want to say that technology comes from aliens, or that language comes from aliens, or that cultures come from aliens, or is it emergent from the natural world, right? And so that's what I mean by this spectrum of human nature technology. So perhaps in a way, climate change is, in a silver lining, this end of human exceptionalism, and the end of this idea that humans can be managers or stewards or vice regents of nature, right? It also means that we live in a world of complex interlinked problems, which urban planning calls these wicked problems, right? That there's no single solution to our problems of climate change and justice issues and poverty, but every solution we have might come up with new problems and it will only address certain things, right? So we have to continually address the effects of our solutions and our ideas. I think I'll skip over, but we also have to really start to look at things like climate refugees, right? This is a new reality, right? So to talk about who or what is indigenous to a place, right? In terms of national borders, may not be helpful. We might need to think in terms of being planetary citizens, right? As islands and coastal areas go underwater, it's going to lead to a huge climate refugee crisis. And how are we going to deal with that, right? So I think we need these new ways of thinking. And finally, I'll end. I think one of the things that climate change does is we do have to ask ourselves what types of worlds we want to live in or help to co-create within the rest of the natural world. So nature then becomes political. Do you want to argue for a world where most species are extinct? There are greater droughts and greater fires and greater floods. There's no more polar bears. There's no more orangutans. The indigenous forests around the world are gone. You want to argue for that world? Go for it. Let's get in the public sphere and argue for it. Tell me why you want that world. Or do you want to argue for a world that sees multiple species flourishing, a greater global economic justice, so on and so forth? Let's get into the political sphere and argue about the world we want to create, right? Rather than saying, oh, this is just the way things are, right? So the third part, right, of our current reattunement, of course, and we're affected by today still, since hence we're online, is of course pandemics, right? How does this last pandemic help us to reattune to our context as human beings within the rest of the natural world, right? And one way that I've thought about it is, is sort of globalization and climate change are leading to what might be called the Great Suffocation, right? And by that, I started looking into research around the phytoplankton in the oceans. And as the oceans, phytoplankton are sort of the key ingredient to life in our oceans. It's what whales take up in vast numbers, what the krill that whales take up in vast numbers eat, right? So, and then whales excrete, and then this more phytoplankton come out of their excretion, and this, anyways, it's part of the key keystone species of the ocean. So what happens then as the oceans warm and these phytoplankton begin to die off? Phytoplankton also supply at any one time up to 70% of the Earth's oxygen, right? So I was trying to, in a science fiction way, imagine what would happen if we lost 70% of the Earth's oxygen due to a phytoplankton die-off, right? Would we then start selling oxygen, right? Like we sell land and water and energy, fire? How have we come to see the Earth's basic elements, earth, air, fire, and water, as things that we can own and sell, right? This is part of my question, right? And so the Great Suffocation then starts from there, the Great Suffocation of life, but it also goes into the I can't breathe of racism, right? The people that are experiencing racism, systemic racism in societies, and they can't get above a poverty level, or they can't move forward in life because of this racism. The racism of sexism, or sorry, the I can't breathe in the suffocation of sexism, right? Women saying, listen, this patriarchal world doesn't allow me to flourish. I can't breathe in the structure, right? The I can't breathe of indigenous peoples because of resource extraction, the taking away of lands, and things like pipeline construction, and coal and mineral extraction. We can't breathe, we can't live, we can't exist without the lands that are our ancestral lands. You are suffocating us, right? The sixth mass extinction that's going on, that's human caused, right? We are not giving enough space for other animals to breathe. And finally, down to the pandemic, right? That is a zoontic a pandemic, right? Because it is an instance in which we overcrowded animal space. And so animal space is now mixed with human space, and diseases are beginning to cross over the species boundary, right? That's the I can't breathe of COVID, right? That's literally suffocating individuals, right? Individual humans. So all of these things, right, are tied together. So maybe this is this current moment. Sorry, if you don't mind just muting, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so these are all the different sort of components of what I'm calling this pandemic reattunement, or the moment of reattunement that we're facing. And here are just some of the ways, some of the thinkers that I'm thinking with that might, and some of the theories that I'm thinking with that might help us to reattune to this planetary humanities, or post-humanities, or whatever we want to call it, right? Some of this comes from Queer Theory by Judith Butler and others, and that suggests that different embodiments matter, right? Our bodies matter. The way that we're born into the world, male, female, brown, black, white, Muslim, Christian, lead to different ways that we're treated in society and different ways that we will succeed in society, right? So just by virtue of me being born a white male, I have this unearned privilege and in the United States than say being born a black woman would, right? So that's what Butler means. Our bodies matter in terms of how we're treated, how our cultures and institutions and societies and laws treat us, right? So by virtue of the way you're born, you experience the world differently, right? But also, she means this in another way, that our bodies are the way that language and cultures and ideas and value matter the world around us, right? Religion shapes the world because we enforce norms and rules about what a woman is, what a man is, who we can sleep with, what we can eat, what types of institutions we can build, how we can treat the earth, right? Our ideas and values matter in the world through our bodies, through the ways that we enforce those things, right? And so that's why I think it's important to have these multiple perspectives, right? So we need all these critical theories. We need people from different racial backgrounds critiquing norms, values, religious ideas, reading texts, doing hermeneutics, this sort of thing, to say, hey, look, we're not represented here. And we need to also be represented. We need feminist and gender analyses, as I mentioned, to do the same thing. Most of monotheistic worlds are built on the basis of patriarchy, right, and favor male voices and male accounts of history. What happens when feminist readers of the Quran go in, or feminist readers of the Bible go in and say, hey, look, what are these women doing here? Let's lift up these voices, see what that's about, right? That's a different type of hermeneutic, right? We also need, as I mentioned, queer studies, right? That look at the different ways of being gendered and sexed in the world, right? You all know that most indigenous communities in Indonesia have more than just two genders and two sexes. There's multiple genders and sexes, right? That all get as different monotheisms come along and impose gender sex dimorphism, right? So all of those different ways of being in the world get backgrounded, right? And say, oh no, you have to be male or female, right? This sort of thing. Disability studies, right? On some accounts, about 60 to 65% of the world experience some form of disability, whether that's wearing eyeglasses, using a cane, being in a wheelchair, having some sort of debilitating disease, right? But we build the world for people that are able-bodied, right? That don't have any of these maladies, right? What would happen if we restructured our infrastructure to take account for the person who needs it the most, right? Who needs sidewalks and ramps and wide enough doors to get into and elevators, right? Why not construct the world so that everybody can participate rather than just those who are at the top of the able-bodiment hierarchy, right? So we need class analyses, right? Different analyses of the wealth distribution in the world and within given nation states, right? So everybody's probably familiar with the champagne glass economy. 1/5 of the world's population controls something like 80% of the world's wealth and resources, right? And then the top 1% controls something like 70% of that, right? So the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos of the world have way too much wealth. And at what point does one person's wealth begin to be at the expense of other people's, other places, and this sort, other people's labor, other places, resource extraction, this sort of thing. We need these post and day colonial analyses, right, that I started off with, right? And post and day colonial studies are for everyone, right? We all need to, including myself, it looks different from where you are, but I have to decolonize my own privileged thinking coming from a modern Western tradition and say, how do I pivot then to listen to the voices that have been left out of the colonial analysis? We also need critical animal studies to look at how we are creatures among other creatures within a planetary community, right? And what do these other animals, what types of things do these other animals do, right? Animals have language, they have communication. Some would argue they have aesthetic sensibilities and experience religious feelings, right? The chimpanzee dance in front of the waterfall is Jane Goodall's famous experiments, or the elephant mourning process when they go to their graveyards. They not only just go to this place, but elephants can figure out the specific relatives that have passed away, and they mourn by those sites, right? So what I'm saying is animal studies help us to realize that we are not we are in a much larger community than just the human community, right? Affect theories, right? So we're not just reasonable people, but we're also emotional. So how have emotions shaped our desires, hopes, and dreams in certain ways that are out of this world, or perhaps not helpful? And finally, I think we need to think more in terms of futuristic, sort of nonfiction, science fiction, creative thinking about our futures, right? Donna Haraway, in one of her most recent books, Staying with the Trouble, ends the book with 3 different science fiction scenarios for a future, right? And she does this because she really believes that we're going to need art, poetry, music, and creative fiction to get our thinking outside of old habits and old ways of thinking of humans as being at the center of the planet if we're going to have a different planetary future. And I think I will stop with that.
Thank you, Whitney. That was really a wonderful presentations, and then it gives us kind of a overarching view of what is the critiques, not only toward the critics to the Anthropocene, but also critics to the more fundamentals, conceptual or thinking, such as the human and so forth. Before we have open our discussion session, I have actually several things that I would like to discuss with you. The first one is that you're mentioning about the question of what actually the so-called human is, and then my other questions, my following question related to that point is that do you think is there any difference between posing that questions about the humanities and also the questions on the life itself? That just kind of reminds me of some one piece written by Stefan Helmreich a long time ago, and then he was actually asking the same questions, but not starting from the notion of the human, but life. So what is actually life? And then actually one of the some of the points that you raise for the critical humanities actually touches upon these kind of questions, not only in terms of, because I see it that human is kind of a more it's kind of a more both it's a values, but at the same time it also the kind of materialities. But if we kind of pose the question in different ways and asking about the life, probably that it brings you to another kind of sort of different kind of reflections, not especially about the kind of materialities that we have, when we are talking about the life. For example, when astrobiology, says something about the life out there, do you think that there's the same kind of life similar to what we have on the earth? Do you have any response to that?
Sure. No, I think this is kind of I think this is one of the, it's a good question. And this is one of the points also that many of the decolonial and indigenous scholars that I've read, and feminist scholars, and queer theory, all these people that I mentioned, is that the problem with starting with something like a hierarchy where all value is up here, right, and all value and all knowledge and all truth is up here, away from the material world, is that then how do you get there, right? And there becomes this identity of, okay, well, humans, right, are somehow right here, and then you have other animals down here, the earth, right? Of course, during colonization, who is human, right? It was a big issue, right? And a lot of people were not seen as human, but they were more like animals, right? So when you start from this question of the human, that's where it leads into these sorts of things, which is why I think listening to the more eminent understandings that you find in indigenous traditions, start, like you said, start with life. All of life is valuable. All of life is this living process that we're an ongoing part of, right? So to me, to answer your question, life for me is nature naturing, right? It's that ongoing process of nature naturing. It's that ongoing process, the natality, right? The newness, the moment by moment creation, right? That's what life is. And I think that extends to the expanding universe, right? Whether we want to talk about, the quantum level or whatever, or the other types of things existing, but that moment by moment coming into existence of something new, right? That's what life is. And if the whole thing is part of an ongoing process, right, of 13.7 billion year cosmic expansion and 4.5 billion year geoevolution, right, then it's all value laden. It's all part of the process. We emerge from this process. We're not sort of plopped down as the people that can see over the whole thing, but rather we come out of it, right? And that produces to me much more of a kinship model of, well, this is, and you find also these types of models in almost every tradition. They're not the dominant religious traditions or philosophical traditions, but you can find them, right? That there's kinship to the rest of the natural world. So it's more like our orangutans are our cousins or our ancestors, right? Something like this. And so we should think of in familial terms, rather than as, and this sort of I'm the boss and I'm going to manage you terms, about the non-human world. I think I went on a little too long there, but I hope that answered.
Yeah, but I think I still have to. I like to follow up on this kind of problem. Is that actually, if we are talking about the life itself, and then the question is definitely it's a material questions, right? So you will be kind of asking what kind of material, put it that way, assemblage that produces the life, and then, for example, like if you have the robot, for example, is it can you talk about the life within that kind of ontology? So I think one thing that you haven't mentioned a lot in your talk was the question of ontology itself. And if we're talking about, if for example, if we are discussing the life, it's certainly the life is becoming one way of talking about not only the world, but also the material constitution of the world, like something that Latour has always brought up in his writing. But do you think that this ontology happens to be there, or do you think that the material processes that bring that ontology into emergence?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I don't think that I think that, I mean, I do follow Latour's work, and I do like sort of the actor network theory and sort of the collective, right? This idea that we don't need nature and culture. We talk about collectives, right, and assemblages from Deleuze and Guattari and this sort of thing. And I do think that if there is anything like an ontology, that's a better way to describe it than discrete entities, right? Why do we call one tree a tree and dissociate it from its roots that are connected underground with the dirt, with the sun? That's, like we are the ones that are making cuts, right? Even one of the early one of the early fathers of ecology, Ernst Haeckel, says species, and this is in the 19th century, species is nomenclature, right? We are making these cuts because we organize things in certain ways, and those cuts that we make organize the world in specific ways. So what if we went to a more relational and sort of interdependent version of ontology, than sort of this isolated Newtonian one that's critiqued that I was critiquing in the beginning of the presentation. So, I mean, I really do think that, you know, there's something to this idea of assemblages. There's something to the idea that we are parts of larger assemblages, and our bodies are assemblages of much smaller things. And there's that sort of stacked, layered, emergent existence all the way around. And whatever we want to call language and culture and thinking and valuing and these sorts of things, it emerges out of that same process. It doesn't mean it's any less real, but it's a different sort of textured layer, right? That then becomes very materialized in the world around us, right? Something like that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I actually have some other question, but let me open the sessions, the forum to the audience. If anyone has questions or any comments on Whitney's presentations, I see here we have maybe Mas Fatun. You can bring up some kind of a question, whether we should talk about Anthropocene or Capitolocene, or maybe other kind of a scene.
Pak Fajar,
Yeah,
thank you for
go ahead, Mas Fatun.
pointing at me. Professor Whitney Bowman, thank you for the presentation. I think it's a great presentation. But I do have some questions. So basically, I'm working on the same issues that human as geological forces, but I'm more on using the Capitolocene as an alternative narrations. But my concern and my questions regarding your presentation is that related that you basically connect the ideas of the Anthropocene as and link to the colonial thinking. And I think this is the point of debate and the point of contradictions for me, because when you use the word Anthropocene, there are two works that basically criticizing Anthropocene as a colonial discourse. So when you discuss that Anthropocene can be linked to the discourse of the coloniality by quoting like Sylvia Wynter, and then indigenous knowledge about it. But there are two persons that write. One is Michael Simpson. Michael Simpson's write about the Anthropocene as a colonial discourse. And then the second one is Adam Bobet. He wrote an edited volume of political geology. Most of the scholar that work with Adam Bobet came from the UK. So Adam also worked in Indonesia regarding the volcanology in Java. And then one of the there are several concerns whether the Anthropocene concept is basically still a colonial discourse. The word itself basically relate to the focus that the only human is the Western human. And then the second one that Simpson criticized is that basically the idea of this current epoch, the periodization, is basically teleological, right? It's basically the same concept like development. When we study about development studies, we think that the West think that, okay, our civilization is like a stages, right? From traditional, and then we go to modern, and then we go to postmodern. This kind of thinking is basically theological also in the context of the Anthropocene, because it seems that the humanity entered this kind of periodizations like teleological. And then the third criticization is that when we go back from the point of view of the history of science, geology itself is a colonial science. Without the word Anthropocene, geology as a discipline emerged, for example, like in 19th centuries, basically based on geological explorations of people from the West to people in the East. For example, when you say about Raffles, when you talk about William Wallace, when you talk about Darwin, these people known as natural scientists and natural science way before the word geology, way before the word geology itself came as a separate discipline from natural science. So I think these kind of things, I think we have to reconsider when we basically appropriate the word Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Fatun.
Yeah.
Also, before you answer, Whitney, I have I'd like to follow up on the second questions. Fatun's second question. The way
Okay.
how these Anthropocene it's kind of a colonial discourse itself. Then my question is that you mentioned in your one of your slide that now is the time of the end of the human exceptionalisms, which I think my other questions and also related to Fatun's second question is that do you think that the end of human exceptionalism is also the end of Anthropocene? Go ahead.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with both of you. That was my whole reason for calling this thinking through the Anthropocene, right? My only reason for using the Anthropocene is that it has taken hold in dominant modern Western discourses, right? And I do critique it. I don't think the capitalist scene is better though, because first of all, communism doesn't do much better for human Earth relations, right? So I think what we need to look at is the fossil fueled era or something like that. This is the energy era, the fossil fueled era, and the different variegations of who got to use that fossil fuel, who extracted it, to show the variation amongst the anthropos, right? So I don't think the Anthropocene is a good word for all of those reasons. I use it at literally thinking through the Anthropocene to try to think away from that. Right, and also that was part of my my critique in talking about Mignolo and the tunnel of time, right, and this whole idea of the movement of a single time, right, up to the Anthropocene, right. So yes, science in its very construction in the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries was done as a colonial project, was done in combination with colonialism. So I don't disagree with you at all. And of course, the Anthropocene is another form of human exceptionalism. And by the way, transhumanists say, yes, the Anthropocene, we're gonna like get off this planet, right? And control nature. So those are all, I couldn't agree more with you there. Yeah. So I'm sorry if that didn't come off in what I was presenting, but I do think it's important to work with, I mean, we have to critique, part of the decolonial process is critiquing also the dominant discourses from within. And so that's what I do with this idea of thinking through the Anthropocene and talking about post-human and this sort of thing. So.
Okay, thank you, Whitney. Yeah, yeah. Now I start to understand. That you're working through the Anthropocene instead of using the Anthropocene as a kind of the critics, the final kind of solution or whatever. Okay, so any other questions? Any other anyone want to jump in and ask the questions or maybe have a comments? Silakan Bapak Ibu kalau ada pertanyaan yang ingin disampaikan.
That's actually a helpful suggestion though, because I think I see how you can see through like with the lenses of, but I meant after. So maybe I'll call it thinking after the Anthropocene, or thinking without the Anthropocene. Thinking without the Anthropocene. There we go.
Yeah. But what do you think of the the position that for example like some of people like Anna Singh uh, uh, think that you can still use the Anthropocene and then you can still work through the Anthropocene, but uh, instead of talking Anthropocene as the Anthropocene, then you are kind of try to disassemble the Anthropocene and looking at the Anthropocene as a what Anna Singh said as a patches of Anthropocene. So what what do you think?
What was that last part? I'm sorry, I cut out for a second.
The patch, your Anthropocene is not the big things, but it consists of different kind of layers and patches and a small thing.
Right, right, and that's why that's why I've turned to thinking about this planetary discourse. It follows people like William Connolly, Gayatri Spivak, Walter Mignolo, and the planetary is the sort of that looks at the sort of stays with the trouble, like Donna Haraway wants you to do, stay with the particulars, right? Instead of thinking this global sort of Anthropocene, right? Look at the different manifestations of everything bubbling up as a result of the consequences of what brought us what people are calling the Anthropocene, right? So that then gives us the texture to the landscape, right? The landscapes that we're dealing with. At the same time, the planetary reminds us that we have to be able to zoom out and see how things are connected, right? We have to be able to look at, because we live in a globalized world, we can't just isolate ourselves. We can't, there's no longer there's no longer a way to isolate ourselves. And if we just try to isolate ourselves, return to our national boundaries, or just return to our local boundaries, that's not going to work. And so we have to look at how our places are linked up with other places through these global flows of energy, information, materials, I think.
Okay. Okay. But I think there are still reservation. I have, for me, I think we have to be careful also to using the notion of the planetary because it tends to obliterate this kind of more locals and not locals but it's kind of a patches and layers because I think that is the most concrete things is happening right now. It's not on the level. Yes, of course, there are the level of the the planetary like the carbon problems and so forth. But at the same time, there's also patches that is also important in terms of talking or looking at the planetary problem. Yeah.
Absolutely, no, absolutely, and that's. I think it's a matter of definitions, right? Because exactly what you're talking about. This is the idea. The the planetary is the emergent process at any given moment, all the local places together, right? And how we link these together, right? So we don't come up with a global solution, but we try to understand better how our current practices are affecting the different places that we're connected to, right?
Yeah.
So when my students are eating a dinner, right? I encourage them to trace their meals from where they came from and do an analysis of where everything came from and how far it had to travel and how the labor practices were, right? So just the very act of eating a daily meal means that you have engaged in interactions of energy, materials, and information with places all over the globe, right? And so that's what I mean, like, how do we connect?
Mm.
If you just have the local place, right, that becomes parochialism, that becomes nationalism, right? So the reason romanticism was so bad in Germany is because it was tied to nationalism, right? But if we have this understanding of a sort of a romanticism, or at least some sort of value re-enchantment of nature that goes across national boundaries and place boundaries and includes whatever the planet is at a given moment, then maybe we disable some of that urge to close the borders, right?
Yeah.
and let get these people out and that sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Oke. Oke, I see Mbak Evi. Silakan.
Thank you, Professor Whitney. It's a very interesting presentation. It actually reminding me of a lot of questions I have in mind. So I want to, I just want to ask you whether to see the Anthropocene as a materiality or as a concept, because, you know, when we are talking about humanity, and actually after I graduate from, I got my master's degree, I got a lot of thinkings about what all I have learned have to do with my life. I mean, how is it changing, and how is it interacting, or how is it continuing the structure in my so-called life. And I come up with a bit of pessimism in a way that, you know, like the Anthropocene itself, I mean, if it is just a concept, then I hardly see the capability of the Anthropocene or the concept to change the structure of the world. I mean, like the structure of power, the structures of things, and yeah, in that sense, I mean, I keep questioning, like, what is human? What am I? Am I human? Am I not? And whether my knowledge on Anthropocene or other theories actually is beneficial to change the what is it, the inequality in the world, something like that. And yeah, I've been questioning that. I mean, it's just like a, maybe it's more like a philosophical question, but I would like you to explore more about it. Thank you.
Well, I mean, part of the reason that I want to think without the Anthropocene, or think after the Anthropocene, or think against the Anthropocene, is to really replace our thinking beyond the boundary of what we call human. And here's what I mean. When I teach classes on religion and nature or earth ethics or anything like that, I always start out by asking my students, what do you think of when you think of nature? And they usually say something like orangutans, forests, rivers, trees. They don't ever say me. They don't ever say the building we're in. They don't ever say the city of Jakarta or the city of Miami, which acts like an organism, taking in materials and spitting out waste, and it has effects to all the organisms. So how is it that we've written humans and our technologies and everything human outside of nature as if we're not a part of it? And how can we rethink ourselves back into it? And I think that there's two different ways that I can view the Anthropocene. One is to say, which some have said this, right? There is now a geological layer, right, that's written into the history of geology, whatever we want to call it, but it's marked by the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuels and this sort of thing. So something about human production has now added a layer on the planet, so we can never say again that, you know, we're not of the planet, right? So that's one interpretation. That's not what I don't think that's quite as useful. So there is a material reality to it, but I do think the concepts we use really matter in the world. If we say the Anthropocene, that gives people, as somebody was just pointing out, maybe it was Fatun earlier, but was pointing out, that gives people like, oh, now the human has arrived and we are the sort of managers of the planet, and now we've created a layer over first nature, and now we live in second nature, which includes only technologies and humans and this sort of thing, right? So that's not what I want. So what I want rather is something, or what I'm calling this planetary thinking, that says, how can we create knowledge, science and otherwise, and technologies that help, that are for the planetary community, not just for some humans, right? That help the planet to flourish and help humans to flourish along within the planet, right? And not just separate some humans above others. And if you can pay for the technologies, then you can have a great life, and if you can't, well, then, you know, you get left behind, right? So that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about what would a planetary technology look like. And if you follow like sort of Buddhists who think about this, or most indigenous people, that technology looks a lot like just stop, rest, step back, and let other things speak and flourish, right? So, I'm thinking of technologies of, and I use technologies broadly here, but religious traditions have lots of those technologies. Step back, stop consuming, pray, reflect on how you have interacted with other humans, how you have done other things, meditate, right? Go on a pilgrimage. These sorts of things, different times that help us to get out of these fossil fuel times of speed, right? I'm actually like, I'm really sad that you got sick, Paksuhari, but I was also in a way thankful I didn't have to wake up at 4 a.m., rush to a train, rush to a plane to Jakarta to do this thing, and then rush all the way back here, right, to Jogja, right? So what are we doing, right? This can help us slow down, right, a little bit and think about what it is we're doing in the world.
Oke, bagaimana Mbak Evi?
Yeah, but it's just that in terms of like, because I was a faculty member and I was now a researcher, and I was just thinking about how theories or concepts doesn't really have something to do with changing the policies or something like that, and then it's like making me question. I mean I can do that. I mean, as individual I can have my own let's say my I can have my own understanding of my understanding of how of the planet, of the earth, of humans. But then how when I look at when I interact with other people, not the privilege, maybe the subalterns in Spivak's terms, I can only make them understand me or the Anthropocene probably by I don't know, like forcing them to speak the language, right? Forcing them to be into the Anthropocene itself, to be the to be the humans. And would that be also I don't know. What do you think?
No, I mean, can the subaltern speak, right? Can the non-anthro speak? I don't know how. I understand what you're saying, and I mean, technically, this should all be in Bahasa Indonesia, but English is privileged in the, so no, I fully understand what you're getting at, and I think this goes back to what a lot of indigenous methodologies, scholars of methodology are saying. How do you mobilize knowledge? It's not enough just to sit in the room and talk about it, but how do you mobilize that knowledge, right? And as a teacher, I do that in the classroom, right? But also, I mean, I've been talking with Pak Suhadi at UIN and also with CRCS at UGM about, CRCS has a sort of theory camp for NGO activists, right? And I'm saying, I was talking about how can we expand that to include UAN and FIU to have this interaction of NGO actors and have like a 6-week theory camp where we just go over some of this and be like, what does this mean to you, and how can you transform what we're saying so that it actually does become mobilized, right? So how can we do technology transfer, if you will, from, I may have gone away. Did I go away? Am I still here? Okay. Sorry, my internet got a little sticky there. But how do we do technology transfer of some of these ideas so that knowledge gets mobilized and beyond the academy and becomes useful for activists, for NGO people, for people that aren't in the academy, right? So it's a huge question. I do appreciate the question and the sentiment, and I struggle with it all the time too. Should I just give this up and like become a Greenpeace activist? Like I don't know.
No, I mean like even NGO. Sorry, maaf, nanti kalau ada yang ada pertanyaan silakan boleh. Even NGOs, it have its own structures. I mean, like funding structures, etc. So, yeah, it's very difficult sometimes not to get trapped into the, Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
two different things. Effie mentioning more Marxist critiques to the structures, and then what Whitney it's describing is kind of a more well, I can call it post Marxist or whatever. You still have the production processes there, but you don't have the structures that kind of binding that production into a particular kind of historical time. I think, but one of maybe the answers offered by Bruno Latour can also answer your question, Effie, that when Bruno Latour differentiate what he called the matters of fact and matters of concern, So this is actually what we are trying to discuss here, or at least what Whitney is trying to discuss is this kind of a matter of concern, Yes, the matter of facts, we have, carbon problems. We also have disaster. We also have political, authoritarianisms and so forth. This is a matter of what Bruno Latour will be calling that is the matter of facts, But we, then the question is, how do we shape the matter of concern? So then the question shift toward more a relational kind of approach, because the concern is actually a relational construction. So that's why Bruno Latour he doesn't really he doesn't really leave that question of the structures and so forth, but he tried to pose the question in different way. Yes, we acknowledge there is a structures, but then the next question is, how do we create how do we find the matter of concern within that kind of different kinds of structures? So this is what got me thinking about, or maybe got me interested in Latour, because this is exactly the kind of question, not only related to the kind of the fact, but also related to the kind what we are going to become, like the futures and speculative design and so forth. So that is the matter of concern in Latourian terms. So maybe this is another way to answer your question, by Effie. Okay. Do we have any other questions or points or comments from the audience? Yes.
Is it possible if I jump in with that
Sure.
last question?
Silakan.
So I might think there are two possible things that Bu Effie asked. I mean I don't know if also Professor Whitney Bowman will be agree, but I think one thing that we can do is basically through ethnography, that we basically reconstruct the knowledge, the local knowledge about what is the earth itself. So what is geology from the perspective of the local knowledge itself? I mean, from the Samin perspective, from the Papuans' perspectives, right? They have their own ontology of the earth, right? That basically that it is the job of ethnographer, for example, to dig up on this kind of cosmology that basically indigenous people have, that what they think about the earth, right? So basically by doing that, we have this our own local narrative about what is geology and what is the earth. And I think this is what uh, Adam Bobet done by focusing on Jogja, on the case of Mount Merapi, to describe people surrounding Merapi, how they define the earth, how they define volcano, those kind of things will be useful to engage, to reflect how this kind of concept can be connected to everyday life and people's daily experience. And then the second one, I think, when we go to the issues of climate change and fossil fuel, one of the problem with the Western philosophy is that they separate human and nature, and they separate society and nature. They separate nature and bodies, for example. Like, this is what we understand as Cartesian dualisms, right? So nature is not something external. For example, like if we talk about climate change, it is something, the concept feels that it's kind of like something that's so big, right? But if we see Jakarta right now, that the air pollutions that we take breath from the air pollutions, it's basically our bodies is already contain climate problem, right? So it's something that basically near within inside our bodies. But the thing is that the way we think, we separate human and nature and bodies and natures. And I think I agree with Professor Whitney Bauman when they talk about bodies and also affect, because these kind of things make possible to connect the bigger concept like climate change, Anthropocene, to people everyday life. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Patul.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
why. Yes, Winnie,
Can
go
I
ahead.
respond to that? Okay. Yeah. So I was going to say, yes, thank you. I couldn't agree more. And I think that I think that we need sort of the lifting up of all of uh, these different local voices and examples. And we also need a ressourcement of historical resources, right? Because when we, every period, I think, can go back and have some sort of rereading. And if we if we look back to the history of most of our philosophical, cultural, and religious traditions, we're going to find some resources there that have been non-dominant, right? For instance, more pantheist voices that you find in mystical traditions, women's voices, right? Voices that don't argue for sort of disembodied thinking, but argue for embodied thinking. And there are lots of those reasons. So I think that there's lots of work to be done in multiple different methodologies around this sort of issue. But yeah, and if I could just say one more thing, I wanted to bring in the voice of Bruno Latour in his last book, After Lockdown and Metamorphosis. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's a good read. But I just want to bring in one little quote from him, because this is his his thinking of, well, after he wrote Gaia, right, the Gaian book, right, this is his thinking after that, right? And he says termites should be our role models, because they do not lay waste to the earth, nor are they themselves, nor are any of them insect Elon Musks who seek to relocate to another planet. That is escapist. But when you think in terms of a critical zone, you're locked in. You cannot escape. By that term, critical zone, he meant a space between 2 and 3 kilometers thick above and below the surface of the earth, but all discovered life is within it, right? So I think that's his need for focusing in on a critical zone instead of outward and upward is just a very, I think, helpful metaphor for what I think a sort of post-humanities or or new understanding of the planetary, whatever you want to call it, might be.
Yes, thank you. That's really a good quote from Latour, and then I I think in filling in that point, that quote, I think what Latour probably would have agreed that we need some kind of a materialities, to fill up that kind of space. Yes, you are trapped, but at the same time, you can see there is a different kind of material. What good friend of mine, Casper Jensen, will say that the material itineraries, there is something going on within that kind of particular, trap. And unless you see the from the point of these, materialities, then you will not be able to see anything, because what you see is kind of what you call earlier is container, but within that container there is different kinds of trajectories, materialities, movement, and so forth. It also taking place to form what you earlier called probably the relational ontology. And Casper Jensen would have say it as a practical ontology, which Okay. Do we have any other question, comments? So if we don't have any other comments, I think we have to end here. And then thank you so much, Whitney, for your inspiring talk and
Thank
also
you. Thank you
discussion.
so much.
And I would like also to thank Mas Wadi for arranging this discussions. And actually, this is part of this his postdoctoral program at the at PRW Brin, and hopefully that we will have another discussion in a few weeks, right, Mas Wadi? Probably. Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining our discussion and for listening to our discussion. And for the next AreaScape or any other activities at the Research Center for Area Studies, untuk semua kegiatan aktivitas di Pusat Riset Kewilayahan, teman-teman bisa cek di Instagram, website Instagram dari Pusat Riset Kewilayahan atau di Facebook Pusat Riset Kewilayahan. Selalu akan kami posting apabila ada kegiatan-kegiatan yang dilakukan oleh Pusat Riset Kewilayahan. Bagi teman-teman yang ingin melihat kembali AreaScape yang sebelumnya, silakan dicek ke YouTube channel kami yang tadi sudah disampaikan di chat room. Ada banyak topik-topik menarik di sana. Tidak hanya terkait dengan area studies, juga ada bahasan terkait virus, juga ada bahasan terkait politik dan lain sebagainya. Baik, terima kasih. Thank you so much again, Whitney, and really appreciate your time. And yeah, hopefully we will be able to get in touch and see each other in person.
Yes. Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Selamat siang teman-teman semua. Sampai jumpa lagi. Jaga selalu kesehatan. Hati-hati. Sekarang kondisi pandemi sedikit naik lagi. Jadi harap jaga diri dan jaga kesehatan masing-masing. Terima kasih. Selamat siang.
Thank you.